It's good to be among scholars, not among barely literate YouTube rabble and their unrefined, unsophisticated videos. Lots of people think that the Satanic Verses is just the title of a Salman Rushdie novel, but the story of the Satanic Verses goes all the way back to 7th century Arabia. Rushdie's novel is called The Satanic Verses because it contains a fictionalized dream sequence about one of the most embarrassing events in the life of Muhammad. According to our earliest Muslim sources, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, once delivered a revelation from Satan. This revelation promoted belief in three pagan goddesses, Allat, Alus, and Manat, as intercessors with Allah. If these stories are correct, Muhammad was tricked into committing the worst possible sin in Islam, the sin of shirk, or associating partners with Allah. Following the Western tradition, we'll refer to what's reported in these sources as the Satanic Verses incident. Islamic tradition refers to this as the story of the cranes as in birds, and we'll soon see why. During the first 2 centuries of Islam, there was a virtual consensus that some version of the Satanic Verses incident occurred. There was a near consensus that it happened. Today in Islam, there's a virtual consensus that no version of the Satanic Verses incident occurred. There's a near consensus that it didn't happen. This is especially interesting because there are so many different Muslim groups in the world with different methodologies. Many of these groups priding themselves on getting their beliefs about Islam from the early Muslim community. And yet, on this topic, they believe the opposite of what the early Muslim community believed, and they frequently regard anyone who agrees with the early Muslim community as heretical. So we have a mystery on our hands. How do you go from a near consensus that something happened to a near consensus that it didn't happen? Turns out we know exactly why the Muslim community changed its collective mind about the Satanic Verses. Islamic theology changed, and this theological change compelled Muslim scholars to rewrite history for the sake of the evolving orthodoxy. To understand how a theological change led to a historical change, we'll begin by reading one version of the Satanic Verses incident to familiarize ourselves with the story. Then we'll consider how non-Muslims evaluate the historicity of the story, and we'll contrast this with how Muslims evaluate the historicity of the story. And finally, we'll see how the Islamic theologically induced revision of history should cause thoughtful Muslims to reevaluate the real source of their beliefs. Here's one of the medium-length reports of the Satanic Verses incident. This is quoted by Tabari in both his history and his Quran commentary. The messenger of God, Muhammad, was seated in a large gathering of Quraysh, that's Muhammad's tribe. He desired that day that nothing come to him from God that would cause them to turn away from him. Muhammad didn't want to receive a revelation that would lead to further hostility from his tribe. And God sent down, by the star when it sets, your companion has not gone astray, nor is he misguided. Those are the opening 2 verses of Surah 53. And the messenger of God recited it until he reached, have you seen Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third, the other? 3 pagan goddesses that were especially dear to Muhammad's tribe. When Satan cast 2 phrases upon him, those high Garnik is untranslated here, it's usually translated as cranes, which makes most sense because the idea is that they're like birds that can carry your prayers up to Allah. Indeed, their intercession is hoped for. He uttered the 2 phrases, then he went on and recited the whole surah. At the end of the surah, he made the sajda, prostration, And the whole gathering made the sajda with him. Walid bin al-Mughira took some of the dirt to his forehead and made the sajda upon it. He was an old man and was unable to make the sajda fully. He had trouble prostrating because of his age. They were satisfied with what he had uttered and said, "We know that Allah gives life and death, and that it is He who creates and sustains. But these gods of ours intercede with Him on our behalf. And when you give them a share, we are with you." So Muhammad's tribe believed that Allah is supreme. But they also believed that Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat intercede with Allah on their behalf. Muhammad finally agreed with them, so they decided to support Muhammad. In the evening, Jibreel, supposedly the angel Gabriel, came to him, and he, the prophet, went over the surah with him. When he, the prophet, reached the two phrases Satan had cast upon him, he, Jibreel, said, "I did not bring you these." And the messenger of God said, "I have fabricated against God and have said on God's behalf that which he did not say." So God revealed to him, "And they strove to tempt you away from that with which we have inspired you, that you might fabricate against us something other than it, until his words, and then you would have found no helper against us." Surah 17, verses 73 to 75. He remained distressed and anxious until there came down, "And we have not sent before you a messenger or a prophet to his words, and God is all-knowing, all-wise." So Muhammad was still worried about what he had done until Allah revealed this verse, Surah 22, verse 52, which we'll look at in a moment. The emigrants in Abyssinia heard that all the people of Mecca had accepted Islam. So they returned to their clans, saying, "They are dearer to us." And they found the people had reverted to their former condition when God had abrogated what Satan cast. Some of the Muslim community had moved to Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, to avoid persecution. But they decided to return to Mecca when they heard that the polytheists had embraced Islam. By the time they returned, however, the polytheists were enemies yet again because Muhammad took back what he had said. Let's look at the two most relevant Quran passages according to the story of the Satanic verses. Surah 53, verses 19 to 22, depending on the translation, originally said something like this: "Have you not heard of Allat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." This promoted the intercession of pagan goddesses. In the Quran now, the passage says, "Have you not heard of Allat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? Are yours the males and his the females? That indeed is an unfair division." Instead of promoting the intercession of pagan goddesses, it's asking why the Arabs would ascribe 3 daughters to Allah when the Arabs prefer male offspring. Why are you saying Allah has daughters and you guys don't like daughters? The other most relevant passage is Surah 22, verse 52, which Allah revealed to comfort Muhammad after he realized what he had done. Allah declares, "And we did not send before you any apostle or prophet, but when he desired, Satan made a suggestion respecting his desire. But Allah annuls that which Satan casts. Then does Allah establish his communications, and Allah is knowing, wise." In other words, Muhammad, don't worry about this too much because it happens to all prophets from time to time. And that comforted Muhammad. There are 2 primary ways we can investigate the authenticity of the Satanic verses incident. First, we can apply the method that historians use to investigate events, the historical method. Second, we can apply the method that Muslims use when they investigate Islamic history, Isnad, criticism. We'll consider both methods and see where the evidence points. How would a non-Muslim historian approach the Satanic verses? We'll keep this simple. The first question a historian is going to ask is, what do our earliest sources say? Generally, earlier reports are more reliable than later reports because later reports are more likely to be embellished or influenced by people's biases. So early testimony is extremely important, and we have to ask what the early Muslim historians said. Here we find that our earliest biographical records, such as Ibn Ishaq and Waqidi, contain Satanic verses reports. We also know that even earlier sources contained reports of the Satanic verses. This isn't something that was invented late in Islamic history. This is something that goes back to the 1st century of Islam. The next question a historian is going to ask is, how many sources are there? Is the story found in just one source, or do we find it in multiple historical reports? The idea here is that if we only have one source telling us that an event occurred, it's possible that someone made it up. But if we have multiple reports telling us the same thing, it seems less likely that someone simply invented it. So when we investigate the Satanic verses, how many historical reports are we dealing with? 1 or 2? 5? 10? We have at least 50 Muslim sources reporting this incident. Not 1, not 2, 50. And if you'd like to read all 50, the late Harvard scholar Shahab Ahmed, unquestionably the greatest authority on the Satanic verses incident in history, translated all 50 of them in his book, Before Orthodoxy, The Satanic Verses in Early Islam. We already read his translation of one of them. So, not only do we find the Satanic verses in our earliest biographical sources, we also find that we have an absolutely astounding number of reports. At this point, the historian is going to ask whether these sources are independent. That is, are a bunch of sources just copying from one source? If that's the case, then even if you have a bunch of sources, there's really only one source, the original source that everyone else copied. So how many independent sources do we have? Here, the Isnads, the chains of transmission, come in handy because Muslims often kept records of where they got their stories. Of the 50 sources we have for this story, 7 go back to Ka'b al-Kharazi, one of Islam's greatest early Quran scholars. 6 go back to Urwa ibn al-Zubair, an early Meccan scholar who's known as the founder of the study of the life of Muhammad. He was also Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter, Asma, one of the first 20 converts to Islam. 5 go back to Abu al-Aliya al-Basri, another of the greatest Quranic scholars of the 1st century. He studied the Quran with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. 2 go back to al-Sudi, another early scholar who studied with Ibn Abbas. 3 reports go back to Qatada ibn Diyama, one of Islam's greatest early commentators. 2 go back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith, one of the top scholars in Islamic law during the 1st century of Islam. 1 comes from the tafsir of Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi, an early commentator who composed the longest tafsir that had been written up until his time. 1 goes back to al-Dahak ibn Muzahim al-Balki, a 1st century expert in tafsir. 4 go back to Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, a Quran scholar who wrote the earliest surviving complete tafsir of the Quran. 3 go back to Mujahid ibn Jabr, who was a student of Ibn Abbas and was called during his lifetime the most learned man alive in tafsir. 1 goes back to Ikramah, a slave of Ibn Abbas and an expert on the life of Muhammad. We have 10 reports that go back to Muhammad's cousin Ibn Abbas, the founder of Quranic studies. When I talk about different reports all being traced back to the same scholar, here's a graphic of what I mean. These are the reports that are traced back just to Muhammad's cousin Ibn Abbas by all these different chains of transmission. Ibn Abbas is at the top. All these other people are transmitting what came from him. We have 3 that go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, one of the leading Quranic scholars of his time and one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. Some of Ibn Abbas's narratives go through Sa'id ibn Jubair. And we have 2 that go back to al-Hasan al-Basri, an early scholar of the Quran and of Sharia. Some of these aren't completely independent because several of these guys knew each other and studied under each other, but there are a lot of independent sources here. It's clear then that we have numerous independent sources for the Satanic verses. These are some of the main criteria a historian would use in evaluating the Satanic verses. We have early sources going back to the 1st century of Islam, if you trace them back. We have multiple sources, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, and we have independent sources, including a number of Islam's best 1st century historians and commentators. But we can go even further. Historians also apply principles such as the principle of embarrassment. The principle of embarrassment states that, as a general rule, dedicated followers of a religious leader don't invent embarrassing stories about their leader. If they're going to invent a story, it's going to be something positive, stories about the leader performing miracles, for instance. What this means is that it just doesn't seem very likely that a bunch of Muslims decided one day to invent a story about Muhammad delivering revelations from the devil. And if non-Muslims had invented it, Muslim scholars certainly wouldn't have passed it on as if it really happened. So it seems absurd to claim that this story was a fabrication. By far, the most plausible explanation for the data we have is that at least some historical core behind these accounts is true. We can see then why most non-Muslim scholars regard this event as indisputable. The great Oxford scholar Guillaume, for instance, says this: "It is impossible to suggest a motive that would induce the early Muslims to write such a story about the Prophet unless it were true. If historical evidence is to be given any value, we must hold that Muhammad pronounced these words in the middle of Surah 53. And Montgomery Watt concludes, Muhammad must have publicly recited the Satanic verses as part of the Quran. It is unthinkable that the story could have been invented by Muslims or foisted upon them by non-Muslims. Now, at this point, Muslims usually make it clear that they don't care much about non-Muslim historical methods. They say, our scholars have looked at the chains of transmission for these stories, and they don't meet our rigorous standards for historicity. If you're not familiar with the Muslim method of historical investigation, Muslims have stories about Muhammad, and those stories come with lists of names. I got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, and so on. A Muslim scholar then looks at these names, and if he's convinced that everyone on the list is trustworthy, and he doesn't have any major objections to the story, he concludes that the story is true. If the Muslim scholar doesn't like all the names on the list, he rejects the story. This is the standard Muslim excuse for rejecting all kinds of historical information about Muhammad, but it's based on a complete misunderstanding of the proper application of Isnad criticism. In the early centuries of Islam, there were three main genres of Islamic literature. First, there was the Sira Maghazi literature, which consisted of straightforward historical narratives about Muhammad or the battles of the early Muslim community. The emphasis of the Sira Maghazi scholars wasn't on establishing doctrine or practice. The emphasis was on providing a biography of Muhammad and sometimes of his companions. Second, there was the tafsir literature. Tafsir scholars provided commentary on the Quran. They weren't obsessed with having chains of transmission going back to a companion of Muhammad, although they would sometimes include isnad chains. But the tafsir scholars would often include any important interpretations of the Quran that they could find. That's why if you look up a Quran verse in Tafsir Qurtubi or Tafsir Ibn Kathir, they might give you a dozen or more interpretations of what a Quran verse means. Third, there was the hadith literature. The hadith literature consisted of sayings and deeds that established orthodox Islamic doctrine and practice. And this was so important to them that they came up with a methodology that supposedly guaranteed the accuracy of their reports. Here's the key. These three kinds of literatures had different methodologies. The hadith scholars insisted on having complete isnads that go all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. The Sira Maghazi scholars often gave abbreviated isnads, or they would simply appeal to a known authority on some issue. They had a different methodology. And the tafsir scholars would try to incorporate everything they could find from respected commentators about whatever Quran verses they were commenting on. Now here's where the error comes in. The main reports of the Satanic verses are found in the Sirah Maghazi literature and in the tafsir literature. We read about the Satanic verses in biographies and in Quran commentaries. Think about why. What orthodox Islamic belief or practice is established by the Satanic verses incident? None. It's biographical information about Muhammad, and it's the background of certain verses in the Quran. That's why the reports are found in the Sirah Maghazi literature and in the tafsir literature. This means that the reports should be judged based on the standards and methodology of the Sirah Maghazi scholars and the tafsir scholars, not on the standards and methodology of the hadith scholars who had a different purpose and a different methodology. But modern Muslims reject the reports by applying the methodology of hadith scholars. And so Muslims who reject the Satanic verses based on hadith methodology are simply confused about the role of isnads in the Sirah Maghazi and tafsir literature. When we examine the Satanic verses reports based on the standards of the Sirah Maghazi and tafsir scholars, we find that the reports are reliable. Indeed, reports of the Satanic verses were accepted by the greatest of the early Sirah scholars and tafsir scholars. So if we judge these reports based on the types of literature they're actually contained in, the reports turn out to be as solid as just about anything from the first century of Islam. But just for fun, let's go ahead and apply the standards of the hadith scholars to the Satanic verses, because sometimes people did include very detailed isnads. Here's an isnad that goes from Ibn Mardaweh back to Ibn Abbas, Muhammad's cousin. Now, this is a complete chain. Al-Suyuti said that it was made up of reliable transmitters. So what excuse do Muslim scholars come up with to reject it? Well, even though almost all of these early guys are known to be reliable, we don't know a lot about Muhammad ibn Ali here. We have no reason to distrust him, but if you're looking for any excuse whatsoever to reject the chain, we don't know much about him. Let's look at another. What's wrong with this isnad? It goes back to Ibn Abbas, and everyone in the chain is reliable. So why don't Muslims accept it? Well, one of the scribes who passed on the report wrote a note saying that he didn't trust it. He didn't trust it for theological reasons. He couldn't believe that Muhammad had delivered the Satanic verses. So a scribe wrote a note saying he didn't trust the report, and Muslim scholars say, there, it says right there that someone didn't trust it. It must be false, despite the fact that the entire chain is sound. If you're looking for any reason to reject a version of the story, you can apparently find one. But if you're looking for the best explanation for the evidence we have, it really, really looks like at least the core of this story is authentic. As I said, hadith scholars were focused on sayings and deeds of Muhammad that established orthodox Islamic belief or practice. And interestingly enough, hadith scholars were fine with Sirah Maghazi and tafsir scholars using different methodologies. The hadith scholars would say, so-and-so is trusted in Sirah, but we don't trust him in hadith. So-and-so is trusted in tafsir, but not in hadith. They understood that they had different purposes with different methodologies. So why apply hadith methodology to reports in different genres that used different methodologies? The Satanic verses incident didn't establish orthodox Islamic belief or practice. Why apply hadith methodology? During the 2nd century of Islam, Muslim scholars modified the doctrine of Ismat al-Anbiya, the protection of the prophets. The doctrine of Allah's protection of the prophets originally meant that Allah will protect a true prophet from persisting in any major error. A prophet might commit some major error, but Allah would bring him out of it. Well, that original doctrine didn't conflict at all with the Satanic verses incident. On the contrary, the Satanic verses incident fit in perfectly with this understanding of Allah's protection of the prophets. Muhammad was deceived, he committed a major error, and Allah corrected him. Since the story didn't violate the doctrine, the Hadith scholars didn't interfere. But the doctrine of Allah's protection of the prophets changed over time. Eventually, during the 2nd century, the doctrine came to mean that Allah would protect a true prophet from committing any major error, and that true prophets are infallible when they transmit revelation. So when this modified doctrine of Allah's protection of his prophets became the orthodox position in the 2nd century, a conflict started brewing. If Allah will protect a true prophet from committing any major error, and if true prophets are infallible when they transmit revelation, then reports of the Satanic verses incident are at odds with Orthodox Islam. In other words, once the doctrine changed, Sirah Maghazi scholars and Tafsir scholars were interfering with and contradicting Orthodox Islamic belief and practice. Hence, the Hadith scholars began stepping in, and over the centuries, the Hadith scholars won in Islam. But we have no obligation to obey the changing standards and doctrines and methodologies of later Muslim scholars, so I don't see how we're under any obligation to reject the Satanic verses incident based on these changing standards and doctrines and methodologies. So we're free to go where the earliest evidence points. We can also encourage our Muslim friends to carefully consider where their beliefs really come from. Hadith methodology doesn't come from Allah or Muhammad. People made it up. Certain doctrines, like Allah's protection of the prophets, were modified by human beings and used to rewrite history. If, God forbid, I were a Muslim, I would obviously have to believe that Muhammad was a prophet. But that wouldn't mean that I have to treat later Muslim theologians and historians as prophets who decide what I have to believe. If I were a Muslim, I think I would solve this problem by rejecting the modified doctrine of Allah's protection of the prophets and return to the original doctrine which allowed Muhammad to fall into major error, only to have Allah pull him out of it.